Imagine, it's the early 1600s. Europe looks peaceful, doesn't it? A colorful map of kingdoms, duchies, and tiny principalities, all nestled under the grand umbrella of the Holy Roman Empire. Life seems to follow a simple, predictable rhythm. Bells ring from church towers, merchants hawk their bread in bustling town squares, and out in the countryside, farmers guide their plows through the soil, just as their fathers and grandfathers did before them. It's a picture of tranquility. But if you listen closely, you can hear something cracking beneath the surface. These aren't cracks in the earth, but in the very soul of the continent. The biggest fault line? Religion. For a century, Europe had been wrestling with a monumental split. On one side, the traditional Catholic faith, with its centuries of history and ritual. On the other, the new, fiery Protestant movements that were sweeping across nations, challenging old authorities and offering a different path to salvation. This wasn't just a theological debate. It was a deeply personal and political divide that set neighbor against neighbor and prince against prince. In public, kings and bishops would exchange pleasantries, offering smiles and handshakes. But behind the closed doors of their courts, the air was thick with suspicion. Secret letters were exchanged, alliances were forged and broken in whispers, and everyone was sizing up everyone else, wondering who they could trust. At the center of this complex web was the Holy Roman Empire itself. It wasn't a single, unified country like France or Spain. Instead, think of it as a loose federation of hundreds of semi-independent states, each with its own ruler, its own laws, and increasingly, its own preferred religion. Trying to keep this sprawling, diverse entity from flying apart was the Holy Roman Emperor, a man named Ferdinand II. Ferdinand was a Habsburg, a member of Europe's most powerful dynasty, and he was a devout, unwavering Catholic. His vision for the empire was one of unity, order, and a return to the one true faith. But to many of his Protestant subjects, his vision looked a lot like oppression. They saw his attempts to consolidate power not as a move toward stability, but as a direct threat to their autonomy and, most importantly, their right to worship as they chose. The tension was particularly high in the Kingdom of Bohemia, a region we now know as the Czech Republic. The Bohemian nobility was largely Protestant, and they had a long history of fiercely defending their rights and privileges. They watched Emperor Ferdinand's rise with growing alarm. They had been granted religious freedoms in the past, but they feared these protections were about to be stripped away. They sent petitions, they voiced their concerns, but they felt their pleas were falling on deaf ears in the imperial capital of Vienna. Ferdinand, for his part, had little patience for what he considered insubordination and heresy. He believed there was only one way, his way, and he was determined to enforce it. The stage was set for a confrontation. All it needed was a spark. And that spark came on a spring day, May 23, 1618. A group of furious Protestant noblemen, their patience completely exhausted, marched up the hill to the Grand Prague Castle, the seat of royal power in Bohemia. They weren't there for a polite discussion. They stormed into a council chamber and confronted two of the emperor's top officials, his royal governors. Accusations flew, voices were raised, and the argument grew more and more heated. The nobles accused the governors of violating their religious freedoms and plotting against them. Then, in a moment of pure, unadulterated rage, the nobles decided to make a statement. They grabbed the two terrified officials, dragged them across the room to a window, and with a final shove, threw them out. They plummeted nearly 70 feet to the ground below. It was a shocking act of rebellion, a direct assault on the emperor's authority. Incredibly, the two men survived. Legend has it they landed in a massive pile of manure that had accumulated in the castle moat, cushioning their fall. Whether it was the dung or divine intervention, as Catholics later claimed, their survival didn't change the significance of the act. This event would go down in history as the Defenestration of Prague. Defenestration literally means the act of throwing someone out of a window. It sounds almost comical, but its consequences were anything but. This wasn't just a local brawl. It was a gauntlet thrown down at the feet of the most powerful man in the empire. The Defenestration of Prague was the single, explosive act that lit the fuse on a powder keg that had been filling for decades. There was no going back. The news spread like wildfire across Europe. For the Bohemians, it was a point of no return. They knew they had crossed a line and that the emperor's wrath would be swift and terrible, so they doubled down. The Bohemian nobles officially deposed Ferdinand as their king, declaring him unfit to rule. In his place they elected their own monarch, a young, ambitious German prince named Frederick V, the Elector of the Palatinate. Frederick was a leading Protestant figure, and the Bohemians hoped his connections, particularly to the King of England, his father-in-law, would bring them the allies and armies they needed to defend their cause. The die was cast. Europe began to choose sides. The Protestant Union, a coalition of German Protestant states, cautiously voiced its support for Frederick. On the other side, the Catholic League, led by the powerful Duke of Bavaria, rallied behind Emperor Ferdinand. Armies, which had been waiting in the wings, began to mobilize. Mercenary captains started recruiting soldiers, promising them pay and plunder. The continent was bracing for war. The first front of this war was Bohemia itself. Emperor Ferdinand wasn't about to let his ancestral kingdom be stolen from him. He gathered a formidable imperial army, reinforced by troops from the Catholic League, and marched to crush the rebellion. The Bohemian dream of an independent Protestant kingdom was tragically short-lived. Frederick, who became known as the Winter King because his reign lasted for just one winter, found that the powerful allies he had counted on were slow to materialize or offered only lukewarm support. The decisive clash came just 2 years after the Defenestration, in November of 1620, on a hill just outside of Prague. The battle was called the Battle of White Mountain. It wasn't a long, drawn-out affair. In just a couple of hours, the veteran imperial forces completely shattered the less experienced Bohemian army. The rebellion was brutally crushed. Frederick and his family fled into exile, and the imperial army occupied Prague. What followed was a harsh reckoning. The Protestant nobles who had led the revolt were rounded up. 27 of them were publicly executed in Prague's Old Town Square. Their lands were confiscated and given to loyal Catholic nobles and imperial generals. Protestantism was outlawed, and the Catholic Church was restored to its former dominance with an iron fist. Bohemia's fight for freedom was over. But the fire that had been lit in Prague had not been extinguished. In fact, the crushing of the Bohemian revolt had the opposite effect. Instead of ending the conflict, it just fanned the flames. The rest of Europe had been watching. Protestant rulers across Germany and beyond saw the fate of Bohemia and feared they could be next. The delicate balance of power had been shattered. Kings and princes who had tried to stay neutral were now being forced to pick a side. What began as a local rebellion over religious rights in a single kingdom was about to spiral into a continental catastrophe. The fall of Bohemia wasn't the end of the story. It was just the end of the first chapter in a brutal, devastating conflict that would rage for another 28 years, pulling in every major power from Spain to Sweden and changing the face of Europe forever. The 30 Years' War had begun. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the pivotal moments that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what you think was the Defenestration of Prague the real starting point, or was a major war already inevitable? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious.